There are nights when the wind forgets to stop, nights when darkness settles over the land not for hours but for months, and the cold becomes a physical presence pressing against every surface. In the North Atlantic during the Viking Age, winter was not a season to endure, it was a world to survive. The people who lived in Iceland and to Greenland during those centuries understood this. They built their homes not above the earth but within it, wrapping themselves in walls of grass and soil that could be 6 feet thick. These were not primitive shelters. They were engineered sanctuaries, designed to hold warmth against a climate that offered none. This is a story about one winter night inside a turf house. It follows no single family, no specific year. It is a description of how sleep happened in those places, how people prepared for darkness, how they arranged themselves for warmth, and how the architecture they built made rest possible when the world outside offered only wind and cold. The night begins at dusk and ends at dawn. Between those 2 points lies a quiet sequence of rituals, materials, and physics that kept life continuous through the long winter months. Let the story unfold slowly. There is no urgency here, only the steady rhythm of survival. The boundary. The winter landscape of Iceland was not silent. Wind moved across the open plains with a low, constant roar unbroken by trees. There were no forests in this part of the world. The birch scrub that grew in sheltered valleys reached only to the waist, offering no resistance to the air currents that swept in from the North Atlantic. When the wind picked up speed, it carried a high-pitched whistle, the sound of pressure finding every gap and surface. During storms, the noise became a sustained howl that could last for days. The sound had texture and variation. On calm days, the wind was a steady drone, like distant machinery running without pause. During storms, it became violent, gusting and shifting direction, sometimes falling to near silence before returning with renewed force. The unpredictability created tension. A sudden gust could tear loose anything not properly secured. A shift in wind direction could drive snow into cracks and gaps that had been protected moments before. Darkness came early. By midwinter, the sun barely cleared the horizon. It rose late, traced a shallow arc across the southern sky, and set within a few hours. What remained was not true night, but a prolonged twilight, a grey dimness that softened the edges of the landscape without offering real light. This period of reduced daylight lasted for months. The people who lived through it adjusted their rhythms accordingly. Work happened in the brief hours of usable light. The rest of the day was spent indoors. The quality of winter light was distinctive. It was flat, shadowless, diffused through clouds and scattered by ice crystals in the air. Colours were muted. The landscape became monochromatic. White snow, grey sky, black rock where wind had scoured away the snow. The lack of strong light affected vision. Eyes adapted to the dimness, pupils dilating to capture as much light as possible. Coming from the bright interior of a firelit hall into the exterior dimness required adjustment. Coming from the exterior into the hall required the opposite adjustment, eyes contracting against the relative brightness of the fire. Snow accumulated slowly, driven by wind rather than falling straight down. It collected in drifts against any vertical surface, smoothing the contours of the land. The turf houses, low and rounded, became part of the terrain. Their grass-covered roofs blended into the hillsides they were built against. From a distance, the only indication of human presence was the thin column of smoke rising from the roof vent. The smoke moved sideways in the wind before dissipating into the grey sky. The snow had its own character. In extreme cold, it was dry and powdery, each flake distinct, the surface of the snowpack loose and shifting. In milder temperatures, near freezing, the snow became wet and heavy, clumping together, the surface developing a crust that could sometimes bear weight. The relationship between humans and snow was intimate. It had to be cleared from doorways daily. It had to be collected for melting into water. It had to be monitored for avalanche danger on slopes. But it also insulated. A thick layer of snow on the turf roof added warmth. Snow piled against the walls reduced heat loss. The concept of innangards and utangards was central to how the Vikings understood space. Innangards meant within the fence, the area of order, law and warmth. It was the farmstead, the hearth, the places where human effort had imposed structure. Utangards meant beyond the fence. The wildlands, the chaotic spaces where cold and danger resided. The boundary between these two realms was not symbolic, it was physical. The walls of the turf house marked the line between a habitable world and a void that could kill. This dichotomy shaped psychology. The interior was controlled and known, safe. The exterior was uncontrolled, unknown, dangerous. Stories of supernatural beings, trolls, draugr, landvatir, placed them firmly in the Utengards. These creatures did not enter the hall unless invited or through trickery. They belonged to the wild spaces, to the darkness beyond the fire's reach. The stories reinforced the importance of the boundary, of maintaining the separation between the two realms. Crossing that boundary was an act of transition. The door to a turf house was not merely an opening. It was a threshold between two states of being. Outside, survival time in exposed wind could be measured in minutes. Inside, warmth accumulated and held. The difference was absolute. The turf house sat low against the hillside, its shape indistinct under layers of snow. The walls were not vertical but sloped, curving gently upward as to meet the roof. This was intentional. The shape allowed wind to flow over the structure rather than pressing against it. The house did not fight the wind. It hid from it. From a distance, the house was almost invisible. Only the smoke and a slight irregularity in the hillside's contour revealed its presence. This invisibility was protective, in a landscape where resources were scarce and neighbours might be days of travel away. Not advertising one's location had advantages, but more fundamentally, the house's integration with the landscape reflected the relationship between inhabitants and environment. The house was not imposed upon the land, but grew from it, built with materials taken from the site itself. As evening approached, the light faded from grey to deeper grey. The temperature dropped. The wind continued. Inside the house, preparations for night had already begun. Crossing into stillness. The door was made of heavy wood, often carved or reinforced with iron fittings. It hung on leather hinges or wooden pivots designed to swing inward. The height of the doorway was deliberately low, requiring anyone entering to duck. This served a defensive purpose in earlier centuries, making it difficult for an armed intruder to rush through. It also served a practical one. A low door reduced the volume of cold air that could flow inside when the door opened. The wood of the door was valuable. If carved, it displayed the household's wealth and the skill of its craftspeople. Geometric patterns were common: interlocking lines, spirals, knotwork. These patterns had no specific symbolic meaning in most cases. They were decoration, a way of transforming a functional object into something that carried aesthetic value. The carving also served a practical purpose. It gave texture to the surface, making the door easier to grip with cold or wet hands. The act of entering began with grasping the door handle, usually a simple wooden bar or iron ring. The door resisted. Its weight and the pressure differential between the warm interior and cold exterior created resistance. Opening it required effort. Once pulled inward, cold air rushed in, a brief invasion of the warmth that had been maintained throughout the day. The rush of cold air was immediate and total. It flowed along the ground first, being denser than the warm air above. Anyone standing near the door felt it on their feet and legs before it rose. The cold air mixed with the warm interior air, creating turbulence disturbing the smoke layer above. For a few moments, the carefully maintained thermal environment was disrupted. This was why entries and exits were kept brief. The door was opened, the person passed through, and the door was closed as quickly as possible. The first space beyond the door was not the main living area. It was a vestibule, a transitional chamber called the Anduri. This room was small, unheated, and designed to function as an airlock. Its purpose was to prevent the direct exchange of interior warmth with exterior cold. When the outer door opened, only the vestibule lost heat. When it closed, the inner door remained shut, preserving the temperature of the main hall. The vestibule served practical functions. Wet clothing and snow-covered boots were left here. Tools and gear used for outdoor work during the brief daylight hours were stored along the walls. The space smelled of damp wool, leather, and cold. The floor was usually packed earth or stone, wet from melted snow tracked in throughout the day. The vestibule's temperature was intermediate. It was warmer than the exterior, protected from wind, benefiting from some heat leaking from the main hall, but much colder than the interior. Standing in the vestibule for any length of time was uncomfortable. The cold seeped through clothing, fingers became numb, breath formed visible clouds. The space was meant for transit, not occupation. Storage in the vestibule had to account for the cold. Items that could be damaged by freezing were not kept here. But tools, leather goods stiff with cold, and snow-caked outer garments were fine. The cold actually helped preserve some items. Leather stayed dry, less prone to mildew. Metal tools did not rust in the dry cold. Standing in the vestibule, the sound of the wind was still present but muffled. The outer door, though closed, was only a single barrier. The wind pressed against it, finding gaps around the frame, creating faint whistles and drafts. The full transformation happened only when crossing the second threshold. The inner door was similar in construction to the outer one, heavy, low, solid. Opening it revealed the main hall, the Skáli. The shift was immediate and absolute. The wind sound stopped. Not reduced, but stopped. The walls of the turf house between 1 and 3 meters thick absorbed sound as effectively as they blocked cold. The silence was dense, complete. It had the quality of a recording studio, a space where external noise simply did not penetrate. The silence was one of the most striking features of the turf house interior. Modern life is filled with continuous background noise, traffic, machinery, electronic devices. The turf house had none of this. When people were quiet, when work paused, the silence was profound. The only sounds were organic, breathing, the crackle of the fire, the settling of the structure. This silence had psychological effects. It focused attention inward, on the immediate environment and the people present. It made speech feel more significant, each word clear and audible. The air inside was warmer. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the vestibule. The difference was enough to be felt on the skin within seconds. The warmth did not come from a single source, but seemed to radiate from all directions, the walls, the floor, the air itself. This was the effect of thermal mass, the slow release of heat that had been absorbed throughout the day. The darkness inside was profound. There were no windows. The only light came from the fire burning in the centre of the hall, and during the evening hours that light was dim. The ceiling was lost in shadow and smoke. The walls, though close, were barely visible. Eyes adjusted slowly, picking out shapes and surfaces by the faint glow of embers. The adjustment to darkness took time. Coming from the exterior twilight into the hall's dimness required several minutes for full adaptation. During this period, vision was limited. People learned to move carefully, knowing where obstacles were by memory rather than sight. The familiar became navigable in darkness. Strangers entering an unfamiliar hall would move hesitantly, feeling their way, relying on guidance from inhabitants. The contrast between the exterior and interior was total. Outside, wind, cold, darkness, chaos. Inside, stillness, warmth, enclosure, order. The threshold was the dividing line. Crossing it brought relief. That relief was physical and psychological. The body immediately began to warm, blood flow returning to extremities, muscles relaxing from the tension of holding against cold. The mind shifted from vigilance to calm, from the alertness required in the dangerous exterior to the relaxation possible in the protected interior. This transition was repeated every time someone entered, reinforcing the house's role as sanctuary. The geometry of the Skáli. The interior of the turf house followed a consistent layout. The main hall, the Skáli, was long and narrow, typically ranging from 15 to 30 metres in length and 4 to 6 metres in width. The proportions were dictated by the limitations of available timber. Roof beams could only span a certain distance before they required support. The solution was a double row of wooden posts running the length of the hall, dividing the interior into 3 aisles. The dimensions varied with the household's wealth and size. A prosperous farmstead might have a hall 30 metres long, capable of housing 20 or more people plus livestock in attached spaces. A smaller, poorer household might have a hall half that size, cramped but adequate for a family of 10. The width was more constrained. Wider halls required longer roof beams, and suitable timber was scarce. 6 metres was near the practical maximum given available materials. The central aisle was the widest, occupying roughly half the total width. Its floor was packed earth or clay, hard from years of use. This was the working space, the passage through the hall, and the location of the fire. The 2 side aisles were narrower and elevated. These raised platforms, called the set, were built from wooden planks laid across support beams. They stood about half a metre above the floor of the central aisle. The timber posts that supported the roof were substantial. They were not thin poles, but thick beams, often carved or left rough depending on the household's wealth. The posts bore the immense weight of the turf roof continuously, transferring it down into stone footings set into the ground. Each post was carefully selected and positioned. The base had to rest on solid stone to prevent sinking. Over time, posts could shift or settle, requiring adjustments with wedges, or, in severe cases, partial rebuilding. The roof structure itself was a layered assembly. The lowest layer, resting directly on the posts and the beams, was often birch bark. Over the bark, thick layers of turf were laid, grass side up. The grass continued to grow during the summer months, turning the roof green and helping to bind the soil together. In winter, the roof was white with snow, adding another insulating layer. The walls were the defining feature of the structure. They were not thin partitions but massive barriers, constructed from blocks of turf stacked in specific patterns. The most sophisticated method was called clambra, a herringbone arrangement where wedge-shaped blocks interlocked. The walls were often built in a sandwich configuration, an outer layer of turf, an inner layer of turf and a core filled with loose earth and stones. The total thickness ranged from 1 to 3 metres. The interior surface of the walls was sometimes lined with wood panelling in wealthier households, but more commonly it was left as exposed turf, smoothed and packed. The turf was dark, rich in colour and slightly damp to the touch. The dampness was constant but not excessive, maintaining a moisture content that prevented cracking while avoiding saturation. There were no windows. In some turf houses, small openings were covered with translucent membranes made from stretched animal stomach or bladder. These allowed a faint, milky light to enter during the day but provided no view of the outside. Most turf houses had no such openings at all. Light came only from the fire and from the roof vent. The absence of windows was a design choice. Windows would have created thermal bridges, paths for heat to escape. The trade-off between a small amount of additional daylight and significant heat loss favoured having no windows at all. The household adapted to living in a space lit only by fire. The roof vent, called the algiori, was a hole in the centre of the roof duct directly above the hearth. Its purpose was to allow smoke to escape. During the day, a shaft of daylight came through this opening, cutting through the interior gloom. At night, it offered a view of the sky, a single patch of stars if the weather was clear, or simply darkness if it was overcast. A wooden cover could be positioned over the vent using a long pole, allowing the household to seal the house completely during blizzards. The luri was carefully sized, typically a circle roughly half a metre in diameter. Too large and excessive heat would escape. Too small and smoke would accumulate. The edges were reinforced with wood to prevent erosion of the turf. The atmosphere inside the hall was thick. Smoke from the fire rose toward the ceiling but did not exit quickly. It accumulated in a layer hovering above head height, slowly filtering out through the luri. The smoke was not choking, it was dispersed enough to breathe comfortably in the lower part of the room, but it was constant. The ceiling beams and rafters were coated in soot darkened by years of exposure. The wood was polished smooth by this accumulation, reflecting the firelight in glossy streaks. The acoustics of the space were unusual. The combination of thick turf walls, dirt floor and wooden platforms absorbed sound. There was no echo. Voices did not carry or reverberate. Speech sounded close, intimate, as though the room itself dampened distance. The crackling of the fire, the shifting of bodies, the scrape of wood on wood, all these sounds were clear but did not echo. This acoustic environment affected how people communicated. Quiet speech was easily heard. There was no need to raise voices to be understood across the hall. Whispered conversations remained private even in the communal space. The absence of echo meant that speech felt direct, personal. The interior was not decorated in the manner of later medieval halls. There were no tapestries, no painted walls, functionality dictated form, storage chests lined the walls, tools hung from pegs, dried fish, called stockfish, hung from the rafters in bundles. Barrels of preserved food and drink were positioned near the walls. The space was organised for efficiency, every object placed where it would be needed. The organisation was carefully considered. Items used daily were kept near the fire where light was best. Tools needed for specific tasks were grouped together. This organisation was maintained through constant use. Everyone in the household knew where things belonged. In the darkness, objects could be found by memory and feel. The sense of enclosure was complete. The low ceiling, thick walls, and narrow proportions created compression without confinement. The space was designed to hold warmth, to concentrate it. The architecture expressed a single purpose, to create a habitable environment inside an uninhabitable climate. The living brick. The material that made the turf house possible was not ordinary soil. It was turf, a specific type of sod cut from the surface of the ground. Turf consisted of a dense mat of grass roots bound together with soil. The roots, grown over years in Iceland's harsh climate, were thick and intertwined. When a block of turf was cut, the roots held the soil together, creating a coherent unit that could be handled and stacked like a brick. The quality of turf varied by location. The best turf came from meadows where grass had grown undisturbed for years, creating dense and strong root systems. Experienced builders knew where to find good turf, and this knowledge was valuable. The cutting of turf was a skilled task. It required a specialised scythe with a broad, flat blade. The cut had to be precise. Too shallow and the block would lack structural integrity. Too deep and it would be unnecessarily heavy. The standard block was roughly 1/2 metre long, 1/4 metre wide and 10 to 15 centimetres thick. Each block weighed between 10 and 20 kilograms when fresh, more when saturated with water. The blade had to slice cleanly through the root mat without tearing. The cutter worked methodically, moving across the field in straight lines, leaving behind a checkerboard pattern of removed turf and exposed soil. The exposed soil would eventually revegetate, but it took years for the root system to redevelop to the density required for harvesting again. The root system within the turf served the same function as reinforcement in modern concrete. The roots distributed stress across the block, preventing it from crumbling or breaking apart. Even after the grass above ground died, the roots below remained functional for years, holding the structure together. Icelandic turf typically contained multiple grass species, each with different root structures that combined to create a composite material stronger than any single species would provide. Air pockets within the turf provided insulation. The soil particles were not tightly packed. Between them were countless small voids filled with air. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which made these pockets effective barriers against temperature transfer. The cold outside could not easily penetrate the turf, and the warmth inside could not easily escape. The thermal mass of turf was equally important. During the day, when the fire was burning and the interior was warmest, the turf walls absorbed heat. At night, when the fire was banked and burning low, the walls slowly released that heat back into the interior. This created a temperature lag, smoothing out the extremes of the daily cycle. Turf, being dense and slightly moist, had substantial heat capacity. Heating it required significant energy, which meant it absorbed heat slowly. Once heated, it cooled slowly, releasing the stored energy over hours. The construction technique determined the wall's effectiveness. The most advanced method was clambra, the herringbone pattern. In this technique, wedge-shaped blocks were cut and stacked so that each block tilted slightly downward toward the exterior. This tilt allowed water to drain away from the core of the wall. Water infiltration was the primary threat to a turf wall. If water pooled inside the wall, it would freeze, expand, and crack the structure. The herringbone pattern prevented this by channeling water outward. The angle of the wedge blocks was critical, approximately 30 to 40 degrees from horizontal. This allowed water to follow gravity outward while maintaining structural integrity. Other techniques included strenga, long strips of turf used to tie walls together or form the base courses, and snida, diamond-shaped blocks used to fill irregular gaps. The wall was not a single homogeneous mass. It was a sandwich. The outer layer faced the weather, built from the best quality turf, tightly fitted, with grass side out. The inner layer faced the interior, smoother, and sometimes plastered with clay or lined with wood. Between these two layers was a core of loose earth, stones, and rubble. This core added mass and thickness without requiring high-quality turf. The three-layer system created a wall that could be 2 or even 3 meters thick at the base, tapering slightly toward the top. Building such a wall required substantial labor. A single turf house might require several thousand blocks of turf. Cutting, transporting, and stacking these blocks took weeks, even with a large workforce. The work was typically done in late summer, when the ground was dry enough to cut cleanly but the turf was still green and pliable. The walls were not static, they settled over time, compressing under their own weight, and they par away into the roof. This settling was expected and accounted for in the design. The walls would shrink by 10 to 15% in the first year. After that, they stabilised. Maintenance involved patching gaps, replacing damaged sections, and occasionally adding a fresh layer of turf to the exterior to maintain the grass cover. Each spring after the snow melted, the walls were inspected and repaired as needed. The effectiveness of turf as a building material was proven by its widespread use. In Iceland, turf construction continued into the 20th century. The earliest examples date to the settlement period in the late 9th century. Archaeological sites show that the basic techniques remained consistent for over 1,000 years. This continuity suggests that the system worked. It was refined over generations but never fundamentally changed because it did not need to be. The house built into time. The placement of the turf house was as important as its construction. The Vikings did not build on flat, exposed ground. They built into hillsides, taking advantage of the earth's natural insulation. A house built into a slope was partially underground. The back wall was dug into the hillside with earth piled against it. The front wall faced outward, but even it was often bermed with oil. Site selection required careful consideration. The ideal location was a south-facing slope, which received maximum sunlight during the brief winter days. The slope had to be gentle enough to allow construction but steep enough to provide natural drainage. The soil had to be stable, not prone to sliding or erosion. Water sources had to be nearby, but not so close that flooding was a risk. The relationship between the house and the hillside was intimate. The house did not sit on the landscape, but merged with it. Excavation removed soil from the hillside, creating a recess into which the house was built. The excavated soil was used to build the walls, nothing wasted. The house became an extension of the hill, shaped from its own substance. Building into the ground provided access to geothermal stability. The surface of the earth responds quickly to changes in air temperature. On a cold winter day, the ground surface can be frozen solid. But below a certain depth, called the frost line, the temperature remains relatively constant. In Iceland, the frost line is roughly 1 metre deep. Below this depth, the soil temperature stays between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of the air temperature above. By excavating the floor of the house below the frost line, the Vikings ensured that the baseline temperature of the interior was above freezing even before a fire was lit. This was a significant advantage. Heating a space from 10 degrees to a comfortable 15 or 20 degrees required far less fuel than heating it from minus 20 degrees. The earth itself provided the first layer of warmth. The excavation process was labour-intensive. The soil had to be removed with hand tools, shovels and spades made of wood or iron. The excavation had to be sized precisely to accommodate the planned structure. The floor of the excavation had to be level and well-drained, sometimes requiring gravel or stone to be laid as a foundation layer. The shape of the house contributed to its effectiveness. The curved, grass-covered roof and the sloped walls created an aerodynamic profile. Wind hitting the structure was deflected upward and over the top rather than slamming directly into a vertical surface. This reduced the structural stress on the walls and minimised heat loss through wind penetration. The house did not resist the wind. It allowed the wind to pass over it, remaining undisturbed beneath. Wind pressure on a vertical wall is substantial. In Icelandic storms, wind speeds could exceed 30 or 40 metres per second. The curved profile of the turf house divided and redirected this force, preventing it from bearing directly on any single surface. This aerodynamic shaping was empirically understood through generations of observation. The roof was a critical component. It was not simply a cover, but an integral part of the insulation system. The roof structure began with timber rafters spanning from wall to wall. These rafters were often made from driftwood, as Iceland had no native trees large enough for construction timber. The driftwood came from Siberia, carried across the Arctic Ocean by currents and deposited on Iceland's northern shores over years of ocean transport. Over the rafters, a layer of birch bark was laid. Birch bark is naturally waterproof, containing oils that repel water. The bark was harvested in late spring when it could be peeled off in large sheets, then dried and stored. When needed, it was soaked to make it pliable, then laid in overlapping sheets over the rafters, creating a continuous waterproof membrane. Above the bark, layers of turf were placed, grass side up. The turf on the roof served the same insulating function as the turf in the walls, trapping air and blocking heat transfer. The grass on the roof continued to grow during the summer. Its roots spread and knit together, binding the roof into a cohesive mat. In winter, the grass died back, but the root structure remained. Snow accumulated on the roof, adding another layer of insulation. The weight of the roof was immense. A fully loaded turf roof could weigh as much as the walls that supported it. This required a robust internal structure. The timber posts inside the hall carried this weight down to stone footings set into the ground. Large, flat stones were carefully positioned, level and stable, to distribute the enormous weight and prevent sinking. The footings had to remain stable through freeze-thaw cycles, requiring placement below the frost line or packing that allowed water drainage. The interior post divided the hall into aisles. The central aisle beneath the ridgeline of the roof was the tallest. A person could stand upright here, though the smoke accumulation near the ceiling made it uncomfortable to remain at full height for long. The side aisles, beneath the lower slopes of the roof, were shorter. The raised platforms here meant that a person sitting on the set had less headroom than someone standing in the central aisle. The house was not an object placed on the land, but a modification of the land itself. It did not dominate the view. It merged with the hillside, visible only by its smoke and the faint outline of its grass-covered roof. This integration was both practical and symbolic. The house was a threshold between the earth and the sky, between the underground stability and the surface chaos. The long fire. The fire was not a single flame, but a sequence of embers and coals, arranged in a long rectangular trough that ran down the centre of the hall. This configuration was called the Languldur, the long fire. It was not the round campfire familiar from modern imagination. It was a linear hearth, designed to distribute heat evenly along the length of the hall. The linear design was intentional and efficient. A circular fire concentrates heat in one location. A long fire distributes heat along its entire length. Multiple people could sit near it simultaneously, each receiving warmth. The design recognised that the hall was a communal space and that the fire needed to serve everyone. The hearth itself was a shallow depression in the packed earth floor, lined with stones. The stones served multiple purposes. They contained the fire, preventing embers from spreading. They absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night. They provided a stable base for cooking vessels. The stones were carefully selected, dense basalt or other volcanic rock that would not explode when heated. The fire burned continuously. It was not lit each morning and extinguished each night. It was maintained as a living presence, tended throughout the day and carefully managed overnight. The continuity of the fire was both practical and symbolic. Practically, relighting a fire from scratch required effort and materials. Maintaining an existing fire was far easier. Symbolically, the fire represented the household's vitality. A continuous fire meant continuous life. The fuel was peat. In Iceland, timber was too valuable to burn. The few trees that grew were small and slow-growing, useful for construction, but not for fuel. Peat, by contrast, was abundant. It was cut from bogs, dried, and stacked for winter use. A household might accumulate several tons of peat before winter began. Peat cutting was seasonal work, done during summer when bogs were accessible and drying conditions were good. The peat was cut into blocks, using a specialised spade, then stacked in pyramids to allow air circulation. The drying process took weeks. Properly dried peat burned with steady heat and manageable smoke. Peat is not wood. It is partially decomposed plant matter, formed over thousands of years in waterlogged conditions. When dried, it becomes a compact, dense fuel. It does not burn with flames like wood. It smoulders. The combustion is slow and steady, producing intense heat with minimal flame. A peat fire glows rather than blazes. The colour is a deep orange red, sometimes tinged with blue where gases burn off. The burn quality of peat made it ideal for the Languldur. The slow combustion meant that the fire did not need constant attention. A well-loaded hearth could burn for hours without additional fuel. The heat output was consistent, not subject to the peaks and valleys of a wood fire. The fire did not crackle or pop, it hissed softly. a sound that blended into the background rather than punctuating it. The sound of peat burning was distinctive. The hiss came from moisture and volatile compounds escaping as the peat heated. The sound was rhythmic, almost like breathing. It provided a constant auditory presence, filling the silence of the hall. During the day, the fire was built up for cooking. Iron cauldrons were suspended from chains attached to roof beams, positioned directly over the coals. Stews and porridges simmered for hours, their contents slowly absorbing heat. Bread was baked on flat stones placed at the edge of the hearth. Fish and meat were smoked by hanging them above the fire, where the rising smoke preserved them. The fire heated more than the air. It heated the stones of the hearth, which radiated warmth outward. It heated the floor around it, which absorbed the heat and released it slowly. It heated the timber posts and beams, which conducted warmth along their length. The fire warmed the entire thermal mass of the building, which in turn warmed the air. This indirect heating was more effective than direct heating alone. Air heats quickly but also cools quickly. Thermal mass, stone, earth, wood, heats slowly but retains heat for hours. By heating the thermal mass during the day, the fire created a reservoir of warmth that sustained the household through the night. As evening approached, the fire was allowed to burn down. Fresh peat was not added. The flames, if there had been any, died away. What remained was a bed of embers, glowing red and orange in the darkness. These embers were enough. They continued to produce heat without producing excessive light or smoke. The transition from day to night was marked by the dimming of the fire, not its extinction. The light from the embers was soft and directional. It illuminated the area immediately around the hearth, but left the rest of the hall in shadow. The glow was warm in colour, tending toward amber and red. It did not flicker dramatically like a flame. It pulsed gently as air currents moved across the embers, causing them to brighten and dim slightly. This gentle variation created a hypnotic effect, the kind of light that does not demand attention but invites it. The psychological effect of ember light was significant. Unlike the active, dancing light of flames, ember light was calm and steady. It did not stimulate or energize. It soothed. The warm colours, red, orange, amber, are associated with rest and warmth. The light prepared the household for sleep, signalling the transition from activity to rest. The smoke from the peat fire was different from wood smoke. It was thicker, heavier, with an earthy smell. The scent was not unpleasant. It was organic, rich, like wet soil or autumn leaves. The smoke rose toward the ceiling, where it spread out and slowly filtered through the leury. Because the smoke was dense, it formed a distinct layer hanging in the upper part of the hall. Below this layer, the air was clearer, breathable. The smoke served a function beyond its role in combustion. It preserved the timber of the roof. The constant exposure to smoke prevented rot and discouraged insects. The beams and rafters, darkened by soot, became harder and more durable over time. The leury, the roof vent, was directly above the hearth. During the day, it allowed a shaft of light to enter, cutting through the smoke and illuminating the central aisle. At night, it provided the only view of the outside world. From inside the hall, looking up, one could see a circle of sky. If the weather was clear, stars were visible. If it was overcast, the opening showed only darkness. If it was snowing, flakes drifted down through the opening, landing in the fire, and hissing briefly before evaporating. A wooden cover could be positioned over the leury using a long pole. During blizzards, when wind drove snow horizontally, the cover was closed to prevent snow from entering the hall. This sealed the house almost completely, cutting off fresh air circulation, but also preventing heat loss and snow infiltration. The air inside became stale, thick with smoke and the smell of bodies, but it remained warm. Closing the leury was a significant decision. It meant accepting reduced air quality in exchange for warmth. The household learned to tolerate the reduced air quality, knowing it was temporary. The fire was the heart of the house. It was the source of light, heat, and cooked food. It was the centre of activity during the day and the focal point during the evening. It was tended with care, fed with measured amounts of peat, and managed so that it never burned too hot or went out. The fire was not a convenience, it was a necessity, and its maintenance was one of the primary tasks of the household. Evening work. As daylight faded, the household gathered in the Skáli. The brief hours of outdoor work were over. Livestock had been fed and secured. Tools had been cleaned and stored. The transition from external labour to internal activity marked the beginning of the evening, a period that in later Icelandic tradition would be known as kvöldvaka, the evening wake. The practice itself likely has roots in the Viking Age, though the specific term emerged later. This was the time after the evening meal when the household remained awake, working by firelight and engaging in collective activities. This was not leisure time, it was a productive time dedicated to tasks that could be performed indoors and that required fine motor skills rather than physical strength. Wool processing was the dominant activity. Iceland's economy was built on wool. Sheep were the primary livestock raised for their fleeces. The wool was Iceland's main export, traded for timber, metal and grain. Every household processed wool throughout the winter, transforming raw fleece into yarn and fabric. The work was continuous, repetitive and essential. A household that produced high-quality vadmal in quantity could accumulate wealth. The process began with sorting. Raw fleece shorn in the spring or summer was stored until winter. It was dirty, filled with lanolin, bits of vegetation and dirt. Women and children sorted through the fleece, separating usable wool from waste. The good wool was washed, though not thoroughly. Lanolin, the natural oil in sheep's wool, was left partially intact, as it helped the fibres cling together during spinning. Carding came next. Carding aligned the wool fibres, preparing them for spinning. 2 wooden paddles covered with wire teeth were used. A clump of wool was placed on one paddle, and the other was drawn across it, combing the fibres parallel. The motion was rhythmic, repetitive. The sound was a soft scraping, the wire teeth catching and releasing the fibres. Carding required attention but not intense concentration. It was a task that could be done while talking or listening. The carding paddles were tools of precision, roughly the size of a hand, with wooden handles and working surfaces covered in hundreds of fine wire teeth. The paddles had to be kept clean, periodically cleared of debris with a thin stick or stiff brush. The rhythm of carding created its own music. Pull, lift, pull, lift. The sound repeated across the room as multiple people worked simultaneously. The coordination was unconscious, no one directed the rhythm, yet the sounds aligned, creating a pattern that filled the space. Children learned by watching, mimicking the motions until their hands developed the muscle memory. Spinning transformed carded wool into yarn. A spindle was used, a simple tool consisting of a stick and a weighted disc. The spinner held a length of carded wool in one hand and the spindle in the other. By twisting the spindle, the fibres were drawn out and twisted together, forming a continuous thread. The motion was practiced, automatic. Skilled spinners could produce yarn while walking, talking, or watching children. The spindle had to be balanced precisely. If the whirl, the weighted disc, was too heavy, it would pull the thread apart. If too light, it would not maintain enough momentum to keep spinning. Each spinner developed a preference, becoming attuned to the particular weight and balance of their own tool. When the spindle reached the ground, the yarn was wound onto the shaft and the process began again. Spinning was work that could be done anywhere in the hall. Some people sat on the set platforms, their feet dangling above the floor. Others stood near the fire, taking advantage of the light. Children learning to spin stayed close to experienced adults, watching the hand movements, asking questions. The teaching was patient, repetitive. A thread that broke meant starting over. Weaving happened on a warp-weighted loom, a vertical frame that stood against one wall of the hall. The loom was substantial, often 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide. The vertical threads, the warp, were held taut by stone or clay weights, hung from their lower ends. The horizontal threads, the weft, were woven through the warp using a wooden shuttle. The process required both hands and constant attention. The weaver stood before the loom, lifting alternating sets of warp threads and passing the shuttle through the gap. The weights on the loom were carefully calibrated. Each needed to be heavy enough to keep the warp threads taut, but not so heavy that they stressed the fibres to breaking. The weights were often made from fired clay, shaped into discs or cylinders with holes through the centre. The weights hung in rows, clacking softly against each other when the loom was adjusted. The sound of the loom was a rhythmic thump. Each pass of the shuttle was followed by the weaver pushing a wooden beam upward, packing the weft threads tightly together. This produced a dull, percussive beat that echoed through the hall. The sound was regular, predictable, like a slow heartbeat. It provided a background rhythm to the evening, a steady pulse that marked the passage of time. The fabric that emerged from the loom was vadmal, thick and coarse. The weaving was tight, the threads packed so densely that the fabric became almost windproof. After leaving the loom, the fabric would be fulled, pounded and worked, while wet to make it even denser. The finished vadmal was stiff, heavy and durable. Not everyone worked with wool. Men repaired tools, carved wood or mended leather. Knives were sharpened on whetstones, the blade drawn across the stone in long, steady strokes. The sound was a soft hiss, metal on stone repeated until the edge was keen. Harness fittings were oiled with animal fat to prevent cracking. Broken implements were fixed. These tasks were practical, necessary and performed with care. Winter was the time to ensure that everything was ready for spring. Carving was both functional and artistic. Handles for tools, pegs for hanging, and spindles for spinning all needed to be shaped from wood. The work was done with small knives, the blade controlled by thumb pressure. Shavings fell to the floor, curling as they separated from the wood. Some carvings were decorative, simple patterns cut into a spoon handle or a door frame, but most were plain, shaped only for use. Leatherwork happened near the fire, where the light was best. Straps and belts that had broken during the year were stitched back together. Holes were punched with an awl, the leather held steady while the pointed tool pushed through. Thread made from sinew was stronger than plant fibre, and did not rot when wet. The stitching had to be tight, each hole aligned precisely with the next. Children participated according to their age and ability. Young children carded wool or sorted fleece. Older children spun yarn or helped with simpler weaving tasks. They fetched tools, held material steady, cleared away scraps. The work was integrated into daily life, not separate from it. Skills were learned by observation and practice, passed from parent to child through demonstration rather than formal instruction. The evening meal had been eaten earlier, before full darkness. The meal was simple. Dried fish, beaten with a hammer to soften it, was a staple. Skyer, a thick cultured milk product similar to yogurt, provided protein and fat. Barley porridge, when grain was available, added calories. The food was functional, designed to sustain rather than delight. Drink was ale, weak and slightly sour. It was brewed from barley or other grains, fermented with wild yeast. The alcohol content was low, enough to make the water safe to drink but not enough to cause intoxication. Ale was consumed throughout the day by adults and children alike. As the household worked, conversation flowed. News was shared. Plans were discussed. Disputes were aired. The social fabric of the community was maintained through these interactions. The work provided a structure for conversation, a reason to gather, and a task to occupy the hands while the mind engaged. Jokes were told, though the humour was dry, understated. Laughter was infrequent but genuine when it came. The household knew each other's patterns of speech, their habits, their quirks. Familiarity bred both comfort and occasional irritation. Living in close quarters for months meant that tensions could arise. The evening work provided a valve for these tensions, a shared activity that reminded everyone of their mutual dependence. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. The smoke layer above shifted and swirled as people moved through the hall. The light was dim but sufficient. The work did not require bright illumination. Hands found the wool, the tools, the shuttle by feel as much as by sight. The dimness was not an obstacle. It was the natural condition of evening, accepted and adapted to. Stories in smoke. At some point during the evening, the work slowed. Hands continued to move, spinning or carding or mending, but the focus shifted. Someone began to speak, not in conversation, but in recitation. A story began. The tradition of oral storytelling was central to Viking culture. In a society with limited literacy, knowledge and history were preserved in memory and transmitted through speech. The stories were not casual tales, but structured narratives, often complex and lengthy. They included family histories, accounts of feuds and alliances, voyages of exploration, and myths of gods and heroes. Literacy existed but was restricted. Runes were known and used, but primarily for inscriptions, marking ownership, recording names, sometimes conveying short messages. Extended writing was rare. The sagas, though eventually written down in the 13th century, existed first as oral traditions passed down through generations. The written versions preserved what had been spoken for centuries, capturing the oral tradition before it was lost. The stories were called sagas. Some sagas were composed in verse, using strict metrical patterns and alliterative structures. Others were prose narratives, equally formalised in their structure. The recitation of a saga was a performance, though not a theatrical one. The speaker did not act out the story. The voice was steady, the delivery measured. The words carried the narrative, not gesture or movement. The formal nature of the recitation served memory. The patterns, metrical structure in poetry, formulaic phrases in prose, provided frameworks that aided recall. A story told in strict metre was easier to remember accurately than freeform prose. The patterns also signalled authority. A reciter who maintained the proper forms demonstrated mastery, earning trust that the content was accurate and unchanged from how previous generations had told it. The reciter was often an elder, someone who had memorised the sagas through repeated listening and who had earned the respect of the household. In some cases, a professional skald, a poet trained in the art of composition and recitation, might be present. But more commonly, the storytelling was done by a member of the household, someone who knew the stories and could share them accurately. The choice of reciter mattered. Some people had better memories than others, some had better voices, clearer diction, more engaging delivery. The recognised saga teller in a household held a position of respect. Their knowledge was valuable, their performance anticipated. Children aspiring to this role would practice quietly, memorising portions of sagas, preparing for the day when they might take on the responsibility. The choice of story depended on the evening, the mood, the recent events of the household. If there had been a dispute during the day, a saga about legal proceedings and honour might be chosen, its lessons obliquely addressing the tension. If a child had asked about distant relatives, a genealogical saga might be recited, tracing the family lines back through generations. If the weather had been particularly harsh, a story of survival and endurance might be appropriate. The selection was strategic. Stories were tools for teaching, for reinforcing values, for managing social dynamics. A saga about the consequences of insult might remind feuding parties of the dangers of letting disputes escalate. A saga about successful voyaging might inspire hope during a difficult winter. A saga about loyalty and betrayal would reinforce the importance of trust within the household. The stories were entertainment, but they were also education and social management. The acoustics of the turf hall shaped the experience. The lack of echo meant that the voice did not reverberate or carry unnaturally. It sounded close, intimate, as though the speaker were addressing each listener individually. The thick walls absorbed sound, preventing it from bouncing back. The voice emerged from the darkness and smoke clear and present, without distortion. The acoustic environment enhanced memorability. In spaces with echoes or background noise, speech can become garbled, harder to understand and remember. In the turf hall's dead acoustic, every word was clear. The listener's attention was held by the voice alone, not distracted by acoustic artifacts. This clarity supported the oral tradition, ensuring that what was heard was understood and could be remembered. The sagas often began with formulaic phrases, markers that signalled the transition from ordinary speech to formal recitation. There was a man named was a common opening, immediately establishing the narrative frame. The listener knew that what followed was not conversation but story, that the rules had changed, that attention was required. These opening formulae served multiple functions. They signalled genre. This was a saga, not a conversation or a casual anecdote. They provided a stable entry point, a familiar beginning that oriented the listener. They also gave the reciter a moment to settle into the performance, to adjust voice and rhythm before the content proper began. The formulae were like an overture, preparing both performer and audience. The content of the sagas varied. Some told of the settlement of Iceland, the voyages from Norway, the division of land among the first families. These stories established identity and legitimacy, connecting the present household to the founding generation. The names were important, who descended from whom, which farms were given to which, families where the boundaries lay. Property and kinship were recorded in memory, preserved through repetition. The Landnamabok, the Book of Settlements, existed in oral form long before it was written down. It catalogued the 400 or so original settlers, their descendants and their land claims. Portions of this vast genealogical and geographical record would be recited during winter evenings, each household knowing its own section intimately and being familiar with the broader framework. The genealogies were not merely lists of names, each name connected to stories, why someone left Norway, how they claimed their land, what feuds they were involved in, whom they married. The genealogies were entry points into narrative, each name potentially unfolding into a full saga. A child learning the genealogy learned the structure that organised hundreds of individual stories. Other sagas recounted feuds, detailing the insults, violence, and legal proceedings that defined social relations. These were not simple tales of good versus evil. They were complex narratives where both sides had legitimate grievances, where honour demanded action, where legal manoeuvring was as important as physical courage. The Eyrbyggja saga described disputes over land and resources on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. The Grettis saga told of an outlaw's struggle against society and his own nature. The feuds were instructive. They taught the consequences of insult and injury. They demonstrated how conflicts escalated, how families became entangled, how blood debts accumulated. They also showed how disputes could be resolved through law rather than violence, how compensation could be negotiated, how honour could be satisfied without endless killing. The sagas were legal education, social instruction, and entertainment bound together. The legal proceedings detailed in the sagas were complex. Icelandic law was sophisticated, involving rules of evidence, procedures for summoning parties, systems of compensation, and penalties for violations. The sagas taught this law by example, showing how it worked in practice. A child growing up hearing these stories absorbed legal principles that would govern their adult life. Still others described journeys to distant lands, encounters with foreign peoples, and the acquisition of wealth and fame. Iceland's position in the North Atlantic made it a crossroads of sorts. Vikings sailed west to Greenland and Vinland, east to Norway and the Baltic, south to the British Isles and beyond. The sagas recorded these voyages, embedding geographical knowledge in narrative form. The Vinland sagas told of Leif Erikson and the exploration of North America. The descriptions of the land, the wild grapes, the timber, the indigenous people were remembered and passed down. Families who had participated in these voyages kept the memories alive, recounting them generation after generation. The knowledge was practical. How long the voyage took, what supplies were needed, what dangers existed. But it was also cultural capital, proof of ancestors' courage and enterprise. The geographical knowledge embedded in sagas was significant. In an era before maps and GPS, knowing how to navigate, where to find harbours, what landmarks to watch for was crucial. The sagas preserved this knowledge in memorable form. A young person planning a voyage could learn from the sagas what previous voyagers had experienced, where they had succeeded, where they had failed. The sagas were not purely historical. They included supernatural elements, ghosts, trolls, shapeshifters, prophecies. These elements were woven into the narrative alongside mundane details of daily life. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not rigid. The stories reflected a worldview in which the two realms overlapped, where the dead could walk and where fate was a tangible force shaping events. Draugr, the undead, appeared in many sagas. These were not mindless creatures but the restless dead, returning to protect treasures or settle old scores. The Grettis saga included scenes of wrestling with Draugr inside farmhouses at night, the hero Grettir fighting creatures that possessed enormous strength and refused to stay in their graves. The descriptions were matter-of-fact, treating the supernatural encounters with the same narrative tone as disputes over sheep or land. The supernatural elements were believed by many and served functions beyond entertainment. They explained misfortune. A bad harvest might be blamed on a troll's interference. They reinforced social norms. Ghosts returned to punish those who violated oaths. They provided psychological comfort. Death was not final. The dead could still influence the world. Whether literally believed or understood metaphorically, the supernatural elements were integral to the saga tradition. Listening to a saga was a communal activity. The entire household heard the same story. Children learned the narratives by repeated exposure, gradually memorizing the details. A child might hear a particular saga dozens of times before reaching adulthood, each telling reinforcing the memory, correcting small errors, adding nuances. Adults reinforced their knowledge, comparing versions, correcting errors, adding details. The sagas were not fixed texts but living traditions, subject to variation and adaptation while maintaining core elements. The variation was controlled. A teller who deviated too far from the accepted version would be corrected. No, that's not how it goes, someone might say, and the recitation would pause while the proper version was established. But within certain bounds, variation was acceptable. One teller might emphasize different details than another, might linger on descriptions one listener found vivid, might compress sections another found tedious. The art was in knowing what to expand and what to condense, in reading the audience, in matching the story to the moment. The feedback during recitation was subtle but real. The reciter monitored the audience. Were they attentive or distracted? Did they react at key moments? Were children following or losing interest? Adjustments were made in real time, slowing down if comprehension seemed poor, speeding up if attention was flagging, emphasizing drama where engagement was needed. The recitation was interactive even when only one person spoke. The act of listening did not require stillness. Hands continued to work. Wool was spun, leather was stitched. The rhythm of the work complemented the rhythm of the speech. The two activities coexisted, one occupying the hands, the other occupying the mind. The combined effect was meditative, a state of focused relaxation where time passed without conscious awareness. The meditative quality was not accidental but cultivated. The repetitive work, the steady voice, the familiar story, all combined to create a state of calm attention. The modern concept of flow applied here. People were absorbed in the activity, not thinking about themselves or their problems, but immersed in the work and the story. This state was restorative, providing psychological relief from the stresses of winter survival. The fire provided the only light. The glow from the embers cast faint shadows on the walls and ceiling. The smoke moved lazily overhead, illuminated from below. The faces of the listeners were half in shadow, their features softened by the dim light. The scene was still, quiet except for the voice of the reciter and the occasional sound of wool being worked or a tool shifting. The visual environment enhanced the storytelling. The dimness allowed imagination to fill in what could not be clearly seen. The shadows created by the fire seemed to move and shift, suggesting forms that matched the narrative. When the story described trolls or ghosts, the shadows could be imagined to harbour them. The visual ambiguity supported the imaginative engagement in it with the story. The stories were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were education, cultural transmission, and social cohesion. They taught values, courage, loyalty, cunning, the importance of reputation. They provided models of behaviour, both positive and negative. They reinforced the social order, reminding everyone of their place within the network of kinship and obligation. They also provided escape, a mental journey beyond the walls of the turf house into a larger world of adventure and conflict. The escapism was valuable. During months of confinement, with the same people, the same walls, the same routine, the mind needed stimulation beyond the immediate environment. The sagas provided that stimulation. They transported the listener to other times and places, allowed vicarious experience of adventure and conflict. This mental escape made the physical confinement tolerable. The length of the sagas varied. Some were short, occupying only 20 or 30 minutes, others were long, continuing for hours or even spanning multiple evenings. The Njál saga, one of the longest and most complex, took several nights to recite in full. The narrative was intricate, with dozens of named characters, multiple plot threads, legal proceedings, battles and burnings. Listeners kept track of the relationships and events, asking questions if they lost the thread. receiving clarifications that were themselves part of the communal knowledge building. The episodic nature of long sagas allowed for natural stopping points. Each evening's recitation ended at a meaningful pause in the narrative, a chapter conclusion, a shift in focus, a moment of rest before the next crisis. This created anticipation. The audience looked forward to the next evening's continuation, wondering what would happen next, even if they had heard the story before. The familiar was made fresh through skilled delivery and communal engagement. As the evening wore on, the stories began to wind down. The reciter reached a natural stopping point, concluding a chapter or episode. The transition was gradual. Conversation resumed, but quieter now. The energy of the household had shifted. The work slowed further. Yawns appeared. Children leaned against adults, their eyes heavy. The time for sleep approached. Banking the fire. Before the household could sleep, the fire had to be prepared. This task was called banking the fire, a ritual performed every night. The survival of the fire through the night was important. If it went out, relighting it in the morning would be difficult and time-consuming. The person responsible for banking the fire was typically the head of the household or the senior woman. The task was trusted to someone experienced, someone who understood the balance required. Too much air and the fire would burn through the peat too quickly, exhausting the fuel before morning. Too little air and the fire would die smothered under the ash. The responsibility carried weight. The fire's continuity represented the household's continuity. Failure meant not just the inconvenience of relighting, but the symbolic break, the bad omen. The person banking the fire took the task seriously, performing it with care developed over years or decades of practice. There was a correct way to do it, and deviation risked failure. The process began with raking the embers. Throughout the evening, the fire had spread across the hearth as peat was consumed and new pieces were added. Now, the remaining embers were gathered together into a compact bed. A long iron rake or a stick was used, pushing the glowing coals into the centre of the hearth. The goal was to create a concentrated source of heat, a core of live coals that would sustain the fire. The raking required judgment. The embers had to be close enough together to maintain each other's heat, but not so compressed that air could not reach them at all. The person raking felt the heat radiating upward, adjusted the position of the rake, Yuzen, experienced to judge when the bed was properly arranged. The work was done in near darkness, relying on the glow of the embers and the tactile feedback of the rake. Once the embers were raked together, they were covered with a layer of ash. The ash came from the hearth itself, the accumulated residue of previous fires. It was fine, powdery and grey. A shovel or flat paddle was used to spread the ash over the embers, covering them completely. The layer needed to be thick enough to reduce airflow, but not so thick that it extinguished the fire. The thickness of the ash layer was critical. Too thin, and the embers would continue burning actively, consuming fuel too quickly. Too thick, and they would die entirely, starved of oxygen. The optimal thickness was perhaps 2 or 3 centimetres, enough to create a barrier, but not complete isolation. The person banking the fire learned this thickness through the practice, developing an intuitive sense of how much ash was needed. The effect of the ash was to starve the embers of oxygen. With less oxygen, the combustion slowed dramatically. The embers stopped glowing visibly. They remained hot, but the heat was insulated by the ash layer. The fire entered a state of suspended animation, neither burning actively nor dying out. It could remain in this state for hours, slowly consuming the remaining fuel while producing minimal smoke or light. The chemistry of this process was not understood in modern terms, but the practical knowledge was precise. The ash acted as insulation and as an oxygen barrier. The remaining oxygen in the ash layer, and the small amount that diffused through it, was just enough to sustain very slow combustion. The heat produced kept the embers hot enough to be revived in the morning, but not so hot that the fuel was consumed overnight. The banked fire continued to radiate heat, though less intensely than during the day. The stones of the hearth, heated throughout the evening, retained warmth and released it gradually. The floor around the fire remained warm to the touch. The air directly above the hearth stayed several degrees warmer than the rest of the hall. This residual heat was enough to prevent the interior temperature from dropping too far overnight. The heat distribution was uneven. Near the hearth, the temperature remained relatively warm. At the far ends of the hall, away from the fire, the temperature dropped more significantly. The sleeping arrangements accounted for this. Those most vulnerable to cold, children, the elderly, the ill, were positioned closer to the hearth. Healthy adults could tolerate the cooler areas farther away. In the morning, the fire would be awakened. The ash would be swept away, exposing the embers. Fresh air would reach the coals, causing them to brighten and glow. Small pieces of kindling or peat would be added, catching flame from the embers. Within minutes, the fire would be fully active again, ready to provide heat and light for the new day. The cycle would repeat, as it had repeated every day for months, for years, for generations. The banking of the fire marked the end of the evening's activities. Once the fire was covered, there was little else to do. The hall was dark except for the faint warmth emanating from beneath the ash. The smoke layer above had thinned, most of it having filtered out through the jury. The temperature had stabilised. The household prepared for sleep. The transition to sleep was not abrupt. People did not leap from activity to unconsciousness. They moved gradually, finishing tasks, putting away tools, arranging bedding, settling into positions. Conversation continued in low voices, discussing the day, planning for tomorrow, sharing thoughts before sleep. The voices faded as individuals drifted off, the transition from waking to sleeping unmarked by any clear boundary. The architecture of sleep. The raised platforms along the sides of the hall, the seal, bore with the sleeping spaces. They were not beds in the modern sense. There were no mattresses, no box springs, no individual frames. The set was a continuous wooden platform, roughly half a metre above the dirt floor of the central aisle. It ran the length of the hall on both sides, interrupted only by doorways or structural posts. The continuity of the platform was intentional. Individual beds would have created gaps, spaces where cold air could circulate and where heat would be lost. The continuous platform maximised the area available for sleeping while minimising exposure to the cold floor below. The platforms were built from wooden planks laid across support beams. The wood was smoothed from use, polished by the friction of bodies and fabric moving across it night after night. In wealthy households, the planks might be fitted tightly together. In poorer ones, gaps between the planks allowed air circulation from below. The height of the platform served a practical purpose. Cold air settled to the floor. By sleeping elevated, the household avoided the coldest layer of air in the room. The construction of the sleeping surface began with a base layer of dried material. Straw was common, harvested in late summer and stored for winter use. Heather was also used, gathered from hillsides and dried. Both materials provided cushioning and insulation. The layer was thick, often 15 to 20 centimetres deep. It compressed under body weight, but retained enough structure to remain comfortable. The choice between straw and heather depended on availability and preference. Straw was softer initially, but broke down faster. Heather was more resilient, maintaining its structure longer. Some households used a mixture, combining the softness of straw with the durability of heather. The straw or heather was not loose. It was contained, held in place by wooden frames or packed tightly enough that it stayed in position. This prevented it from shifting during the night. Over the course of a winter, the material would break down, compressing further. Every few weeks, it needed to be fluffed, rearranged, and supplemented with fresh material. Over the straw, sheepskins were laid. Sheepskins were the fundamental textile of Viking Iceland. Every household had them in abundance. The skins were tanned with the wool still attached, creating a thick, heavy covering. The wool side faced upward, providing a soft surface to lie on. The leather side faced down, creating a moisture barrier that protected the straw beneath. The wool of Icelandic sheep was particularly well suited to this purpose. It was dense, with a high lanolin content. Lanolin is a natural oil that repels water and traps air. The air pockets within the wool fibres created insulation, preventing body heat from escaping downward into the straw. The wool also wicking moisture away from the skin, keeping sleepers dry, even as they perspired during the night. Multiple sheepskins were used, overlapping to create a continuous surface. A single platform might require 10 or 15 skins, depending on the length of the hall and the number of people sleeping there. The skins were not sewn together, but laid loose. This allowed them to be removed individually for cleaning or airing. During the brief summer months, the sheepskins were taken outside, beaten to remove dust and debris, and left in the sun to dry. On top of the sheepskins, woolen blankets were placed. These blankets, called veidmal, were woven from Icelandic wool using the same looms that produced fabric for clothing and trade. Vadmal was thick, coarse, and extremely durable. It was felted during the weaving process, making it dense and windproof. A single vadmal blanket could weigh several kilograms. The weight was part of its effectiveness. The heavy fabric pressed down on the body, reducing heat loss and creating a sense of enclosure. In wealthier households, a different material was used: eiderdown. Eiderdown is the soft, insulating feathers found beneath the outer plumage of the eider duck. These ducks nested along the coasts of Iceland and Greenland. The Vikings harvested the down from abandoned nests after the ducklings had fledged, taking care not to harm the birds. Eiderdown has exceptional insulating properties. It is lighter than wool but warmer. A duvet filled with eiderdown can keep a person warm in temperatures well below freezing, while weighing only a fraction of what a wool blanket weighs. The down traps air in microscopic pockets, creating a barrier that prevents heat transfer. Not everyone had access to eiderdown. It was expensive, labour-intensive to harvest, and reserved for the heads of households or honoured guests. The sleeping arrangements reflected the social structure of the household. The head of the household and his wife occupied a position of prominence, usually at the far end of the hall away from the door. In some houses, they had a lokrekja, a closet bed, a small enclosed space with wooden walls on 3 sides and a curtain or sliding door on the 4th. This provided the only privacy in the house. The lokrekja was not large. It was just wide enough for 2 people to lie side by side, with minimal space above to sit upright. The enclosure served multiple purposes. It blocked drafts, concentrating warmth. It reduced noise, allowing the occupants to sleep through the movements and sounds of the rest of the household. It also signalled status, marking the separation between the head of the household and then everyone else. The rest of the household slept in the open on the set. There were no partitions, no individual sleeping areas. People lay in rows, side by side, their bodies close together. The arrangement was practical. Shared body heat increased the ambient temperature around each sleeper. Children slept between adults or in clusters with other children. The youngest were often placed in the middle, surrounded by older family members whose body heat kept them warmest. Infants might sleep in cradles near the fire, or be brought into bed with their mothers for nursing during the night. Dogs, if the household had them, slept at the feet of their owners or near the fire. Livestock was sometimes kept in an attached byre, a lower room or basement area where their body heat rose through gaps in the floorboards, contributing to the warmth of the living space above. The sleeping positions varied. Some people lay with their heads toward the centre of the hall, their feet toward the wall. This kept their heads near the warmer air rising from the banked fire. Others reversed the position, placing their feet toward the fire and their heads toward the wall, avoiding the residual smoke that lingered near the ceiling. There was no single correct orientation. The choice was personal, based on individual preference and tolerance. Nightwear was minimal. People did not sleep in the heavy woolen overtunics they wore during the day. These garments were removed and used as additional blankets or pillows. What remained was the serk, a linen undertunic. Linen was softer than wool, less likely to irritate the skin during the night. It was also easier to wash, though washing happened infrequently during the winter months. The serk was a simple garment, reaching to mid-thigh or knee. It was loose-fitting, allowing freedom of movement. Some people slept in their serk. Others removed it entirely, sleeping nude under the layers of wool and skin. The choice depended on personal preference and the temperature of the hall. The preparation for sleep was efficient. There were no lengthy bedtime routines, no separate rooms to move through. People finished their evening tasks, moved to their places on the set, and lay down. The transition from waking to sleeping was gradual, not marked by a clear boundary. Conversation continued in low voices, fading as individuals drifted off. The shared warmth. Sleep in the turf house was a collective experience. The physical proximity of 15 to 20 people created an environment that was fundamentally different from solitary rest. Bodies generated heat. An average adult at rest produces roughly 75 to 100 watts of thermal energy. Multiply that by the 20 people, and the combined heat output was between 1500 and 2000 watts, without any fire at all. This collective heat output raised the ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity of the sleepers, If the hall's baseline temperature was 10 degrees Celsius, the area around the sleeping platforms might be 15 or even 20 degrees. The bodies acted as individual heating elements, their combined effect warming the air and the surfaces around them. The sheepskins and vadmal blankets trapped this heat, preventing it from dissipating into the larger volume of the hall. The arrangement was not random. Families slept in clusters, parents and children formed groups, their bodies creating small zones of concentrated warmth. Elders, whose bodies generated less heat, were positioned between younger adults. Infants and toddlers, who had the least ability to regulate their own temperature, were placed in the warmest positions surrounded by adults. The positioning was strategic, based on understanding of who needed more warmth. Metabolic rate varied by age and health. Young children burned calories rapidly, but also lost heat rapidly due to their small mass. The elderly generated less heat and were more vulnerable to cold. Pregnant women, the ill, all needed more warmth. The sleeping arrangement accommodated these variations. The physical contact was constant. Arms touched, legs overlapped, bodies shifted during the night, unconsciously seeking warmth or adjusting position, but never moving far from the person next to them. This proximity was not uncomfortable. It was expected, normal, the way sleep happened. Survival took precedence over privacy. Modern people, accustomed to personal space, might find this proximity claustrophobic. But in a cold environment, with no alternative heating, proximity meant survival. The contact was not invasive, but protective. The warmth of another body was comforting, reassuring. The shared warmth was supplemented by the materials of the bed. The sheepskins beneath trapped the heat radiating downward from the bodies. The wool fibres, filled with lanolin, created an insulating layer that prevented the cold from the floor below from penetrating upward. The vadmal blankets above performed the same function in reverse, trapping the heat rising from the bodies and preventing it from escaping into the cooler air above. Within the layers of wool and skin, the temperature was comfortable, even cozy. Outside those layers, in the open air of the hall, the temperature was significantly cooler. The contrast was sharp. Extending an arm from beneath the blankets meant feeling the cold air immediately. This contrast reinforced the desire to stay under the covers, to remain within the warm cocoon created by the bedding and the collective body heat. Breathing was audible. 20 people sleeping in one room produced a soundscape of inhalations and exhalations, rhythmic and overlapping. Some breathed deeply, slowly. Others breathed more quickly. The patterns varied, but together created a kind of ambient noise, a white noise of human presence. The sound was comforting. It signaled that others were near, that the household was intact. The breathing patterns changed through the night. In deep sleep, breathing was slow and regular. In lighter sleep stages, breathing became more variable. The household unconsciously monitored these patterns. A change in someone's breathing might prompt another person to check on them, even without fully waking. Occasionally someone would shift position, the wooden planks of the set creaking under the movement. A child might murmur in sleep. A dog might stretch and resettle. These sounds were familiar, non-threatening. They did not wake the others. The household had adapted to them, learned to sleep through them. Only unusual sounds, a loud crack from the roof, a gust of wind finding a gap, would cause someone to stir. The adaptation to sound was learned. Infants woke at every noise. By childhood, most sounds were filtered. By adulthood, only significant sounds prompted waking. This adaptation was necessary for survival. The brain learned to distinguish between normal background sounds and sounds that signaled danger. The Lochrecchia, the closet bed, offered a different experience. Inside the enclosed space, the warmth was even more concentrated. The wooden walls on three sides blocked drafts and reflected heat back toward the occupants. The curtain or door on the fourth side could be drawn closed, creating a small private chamber. The air inside became warm quickly, almost stuffy. The head of the household and his wife, sleeping in the Lochrecchia, experienced a level of comfort not available to the rest of their household. The enclosure provided not just warmth but psychological separation. Behind the closed door, they were apart from the collective, able to speak privately or simply rest without the constant awareness of others. This separation was a privilege, a marker of status within the household hierarchy. Outside the Lochrecchia, on the open set, sleep was less isolated but no less effective. The collective warmth made up for the lack of enclosure. The presence of others provided a different kind of comfort. The assurance that one was not alone, that the household was functioning, that life continued. The shared experience created bonds, reinforced kinship, reminded everyone of their place within the group. The social bonding that occurred through shared sleep was significant. Trust was built through vulnerability. Sleeping together meant being defenseless together, trusting others to maintain the fire, to wake if danger appeared, to share warmth rather than hoarding it. This trust extended into waking life, creating social cohesion that strengthened the household as a unit. Children adapted easily to this arrangement. They grew up sleeping in proximity unto others and knew no alternative. For them, the warmth and presence of family members was normal, the baseline condition of sleep. The idea of sleeping alone in a separate room would have seemed strange, even frightening. Safety and warmth came from being together, not apart. Children's psychological development was shaped by this environment. They learned early that individuals were part of a collective, that survival depended on cooperation, that privacy was less important than community. These lessons affected adult behaviour, creating a culture that valued group solidarity over individual autonomy. Adults too found the arrangement natural. The modern preference for solitary sleep is a recent development, made possible by central heating and private bedrooms. In a cold climate with limited fuel and no artificial heating, solitary sleep was impractical. The collective arrangement was not a compromise. It was the solution, the method that worked. The shared warmth extended beyond the immediate sleeping surface. The bodies on the set warmed the wooden planks beneath them. The planks conducted this heat along their length, warming adjacent areas. Over the course of the night, the entire platform became warmer, creating a consistent environment along its length. This thermal environment was self-regulating. If someone became too warm, they shifted position, moved slightly away from the person next to them, or uncovered an arm or leg. If someone became too cold, they moved closer, pulled the blankets tighter, or repositioned themselves nearer to the centre of the group. These adjustments happened unconsciously, driven by the body's automatic responses to temperature changes. The hours of deep night. The hall settled into darkness. The fire, banked and covered with ash, produced almost no light. The glow from the embers was hidden beneath the grey layer, visible only as a faint warmth if one looked directly at the hearth. The lowery, the roof vent, showed a circle of night sky. If the weather was clear, stars were visible, faint points of light in the blackness. If it was overcast, the opening revealed nothing, just a darker shade of black against the dark interior. The stars visible through the lowery changed position slowly through the night. The rotation of the earth moved them across the small circle of visible sky. Someone waking and looking up might see different stars than they had seen when first lying down. This movement marked time in a way that was visible but not precise. The silence was profound. Outside, the wind might still be blowing, but the thick turf walls absorbed the sound completely. Inside, there was no wind noise, no rustling, no external disturbance. The hall existed in a pocket of stillness, separated from the chaos beyond. The only sounds were internal, the breathing of sleepers, the occasional creak of timber, the soft hiss of the banked fire. The quality of silence in the turf house was unlike silence in most environments. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of absorption. The turf walls, the dirt floor, the wooden platforms, all absorbed sound. There was no reverberation, no echo. The breathing was the dominant sound. 20 people, each drawing air in and out, created a rhythm. The breaths were not synchronized. They overlapped, creating a continuous layered sound. Some breathed deeply, their inhalations slow and audible. Others breathed more shallowly, their exhalations barely perceptible. Together, they filled the acoustic space with a gentle, constant presence. The quality of the breathing changed throughout the night. In the first hours of sleep, the breathing was heavier, deeper, as bodies relaxed fully from the day's exertions. Later, in the middle hours, the breathing became lighter, more even. Toward morning, restlessness increased. Bodies shifted more frequently. The breathing became irregular as people entered lighter stages of sleep or briefly surfaced toward waking before drifting down again. The timber posts and beams responded to the weight above them. The roof, heavy with turf and snow, pressed down on the structure. The wood compressed slightly, releasing tension in small increments. This produced faint creaks and groans, sounds that had no pattern but were familiar to everyone in the household. The house was settling, adjusting, talking in its own language. These sounds were not alarming. They were reassuring, evidence that the structure was intact and holding. Each beam had its own voice. The central ridgepole, bearing the greatest load, produced a deep creak when it adjusted. The smaller rafters made higher-pitched sounds. The posts, compressed vertically, occasionally released stress with a sharp crack. No one woke at these sounds. They were part of the house's vocabulary, understood and expected. The banked fire hissed occasionally. Pockets of moisture in the peat, heated by the smouldering embers, turned to steam and escaped with a soft sound. The hiss was quiet, easily lost beneath the breathing, but audible in moments of deeper silence. It was a reminder that the fire was still alive, still warm, still present at the centre of the hall. Dogs, if they were present, shifted in their sleep. They curled tighter, tucking their noses under their tails to conserve warmth. Occasionally one would dream its legs twitching, a faint whimper escaping. The sound was brief, quickly subsiding as the dog settled back into deeper sleep. The dogs served a function beyond companionship. They were early warning systems, alert to sounds, burns, and bone movements that humans might miss. Even in sleep they maintained a level of awareness. The smell of the hall was complex. Smoke was the primary note, thick and earthy from the peat. Beneath that was the scent of lanolin, the natural oil in the wool of the sheepskins and blankets. It had a sweet, slightly musky quality. The smell of dried fish hung in the air, coming from the stockfish suspended from the rafters. There was also the faint scent of bodies, sweat, skin, breath. The accumulated odour of people living in close proximity. The smell was not offensive to those who lived with it. It was familiar, normal, the scent of home. Only a stranger entering from outside would notice it consciously. For the household, the smell was background, as natural and unremarkable as the feel of wool or the taste of stock fish. The temperature in the hall was stable. The banked fire provided a baseline of warmth. The collective body heat of the sleepers added to it. The thick turf walls, having absorbed heat throughout the day, released it slowly back into the interior. The combination maintained an ambient temperature that was cool, but not cold. Someone waking in the night would feel the chill of the air on their face, but remain warm beneath the layers of wool and skin. The temperature varied by location. Near the hearth, even with the fire banked, the air was warmest. At the far ends of the hall, away from the hearth, the temperature was several degrees cooler. The sleeping platforms, elevated above the floor, were warmer than the central aisle. The Locrecchia, enclosed on 3 sides, was warmest of all. The darkness was total. There were no artificial lights, no glowing devices, no ambient illumination from outside. The human eye, adapted to the darkness, could discern shapes after several minutes. The outline of a post, the edge of the set, the faint curve of the roof, but detail was lost. The darkness was not hostile. It was simply the absence of light, a condition that the household had adapted to over generations. The darkness also enhanced other senses. Without visual input, the brain attended more closely to sound, touch, smell. The rustling of fabric was more noticeable. The warmth of a nearby body was more apparent. The darkness forced sensory redistribution, heightening awareness in non-visual domains. Through the Liori, the sky slowly changed. Stars moved across the opening, their positions shifting as the earth rotated. If clouds moved in, the stars vanished, and the opening became a uniform black. If it began to snow, flakes drifted down through the vent, landing in the hearth where they melted instantly on contact with the warm stones. The snow falling through the Liori created a gentle sound, a soft pattering as flakes hit the stones and evaporated. The sound was soothing, rhythmic. It signalled that outside the world continued. Weather moved, seasons progressed. But inside the household was protected, separate, safe. Time passed without measurement. There were no clocks, no way to gauge the hours. Sleep happened in cycles, periods of deeper rest alternating with lighter phases, where awareness returned briefly before fading again. Some people woke once or twice during the night, their bladders full or their position uncomfortable. They rose, careful not to disturb those around them, and moved to the vestibule where a bucket served as a chamber pot. The cold air of the vestibule was shocking, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the set. The temperature differential between the main hall and the vestibule might be 10 or 15 degrees. The task was completed as quickly as possible. No one lingered. The return to the set was urgent, driven by the need to escape the cold. Slipping back under the blankets was relief, but the body's core temperature had dropped. It took several minutes for the layers of wool to trap enough heat to restore comfort. Children slept more soundly than adults. Their bodies, exhausted from the day's activities, fell into deep rest quickly. They rarely woke during the night, their breathing steady and rhythmic. The adults, more attuned to the sounds and conditions of the hall, slept more lightly. They remained aware, even in sleep, of changes in temperature, unusual sounds, or movements within the household. This lighter sleep was adaptive. In a household where fire was essential and accidents possible, someone needed to remain partially vigilant. The adults rotated this responsibility unconsciously, each taking turns in lighter versus deeper sleep stages throughout the night. The household did not sleep in unison. Some fell asleep quickly after lying down. Others remained awake longer, their minds occupied with thoughts of the day past or the day to come. Gradually, over the course of an hour or more, everyone drifted off. The last sounds of waking, a cough, a murmured word, the rustle of fabric, ceased. The hall entered the deepest phase of night, where everyone slept and the only sounds were involuntary. Dreams occurred but were rarely remembered. The cold environment, the physical exhaustion from daily labour, and the constant low-level stimulation of living in a communal space all contributed to deep, dreamless sleep for most people. When dreams did occur, they were influenced by the environment, visions of warmth and cold, of darkness and light, of journeys and returns. The night stretched on. Hours passed. The interior temperature dropped slightly as the heat absorbed by the walls and floor during the day was gradually exhausted. The drop was minimal, a degree or two. Not enough to wake anyone, but enough to cause sleepers to unconsciously pull the blankets tighter or move closer to the person next to them. The temperature drop accelerated in the hours before dawn. This was the coldest part of the night, when the residual heat from the previous day was nearly exhausted, and the new day's warmth had not yet begun. The fire, banked hours before, provided minimal heat. The stones of the hearth had cooled significantly. The interior reached its minimum temperature. The banked fire continued to smoulder beneath its covering of ash. The peat burned so slowly that a well-banked fire could last 8 to 10 hours without attention. The embers remained hot, glowing faintly beneath the ash, waiting to be awakened in the morning. The house itself became part of the sleeping environment. The thick walls, the heavy roof, the layered bedding, the collective bodies, all combined to create a system that maintained livable conditions through the coldest part of the night. The system required no active management once the fire was banked and everyone had settled to sleep. It was a passive system, relying on materials and design, rather than constant intervention. The system complete. The turf house worked as a system. Each element, the thick walls, the semi-subterranean placement, the banked fire, the communal sleeping, the layered bedding, contributed to the whole. Remove any single element and the effectiveness would diminish. Together, they created conditions that allowed survival through months of cold and darkness. The walls, floor and roof formed a thermal envelope that buffered the interior from external temperature swings. While the air temperature outside might change by 20 degrees over the course of a night, the interior changed by only 2 or 3 degrees. This stability meant the household did not wake to freezing conditions. The warmth built during the day persisted through the night, maintained by the slow release of heat from the building's mass. The fire provided supplemental heat, but the passive system, the Earth's baseline temperature, the insulating walls, the trapped body heat did most of the work. The fire needed only to add a few degrees to an interior that already maintained above freezing temperatures. This modest requirement meant fuel consumption was manageable. The household could survive the winter on available peat supplies because the architectural system reduced heating demands to sustainable levels. The collective sleeping arrangement transformed individual vulnerability into shared resilience. A person sleeping alone in a cold room would struggle to maintain body temperature. 20 people sleeping together created a microclimate, a zone of warmth that sustained everyone. The system worked because of cooperation, not just architecture. The knowledge required to build and maintain this system was passed down through generations. Young people learned by participating, helping to cut turf, stack blocks, tend the fire, process wool, The skills were not written source down. They were embodied, practiced, refined through repetition. Each generation added small improvements, adapted techniques to local conditions, and passed the accumulated knowledge to the next. The turf house represented a particular relationship with the environment. It did not attempt to dominate or transform the landscape. It worked with available materials, accepted natural constraints, and achieved comfort through intelligent adaptation. The house was effective because it understood the physics of heat, the properties of materials, and the realities of the climate, even if that understanding was not expressed in scientific terms. The uncovering. The first indication of morning was not light, but sound. A faint stirring, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the set as someone shifted position. The household did not wake all at once. One person woke first, usually the same person each morning, the one responsible for the fire. The waking was gradual. Eyes opened in darkness. The person lay still for a moment, gathering awareness, feeling the cold air on their face. The warmth beneath the blankets was tempting, but the task was necessary. They moved slowly, carefully, extracting themselves from the layers of wool and skin and without disturbing the person next to them. The cold air was immediate, sharp against exposed skin. The transition from warmth to cold required will, every instinct urge staying beneath the covers, but responsibility demanded action. The person rose, their body registering protest at the cold, their mind overriding the discomfort with purpose. This small act of will, repeated every morning, was part of how survival happened. Choosing duty over comfort, maintaining the patterns that kept the household alive. The hall was still dark. Through the Luri, the sky showed the first signs of change. Not light, but a lessening of darkness, a shift from black to deep blue. Stars were fading. The circle of sky visible through the vent was the only connection to the world outside. Everything else was enclosed, hidden within the thick walls. The change in the sky was subtle but meaningful. It marked the end of the long night, the beginning of transition toward a day. The person who rose first saw this change every morning. It was private knowledge, a moment of solitude before the household awakened. Some found this moment peaceful, a brief time of quietness before the day's demands began. The person who rose moved toward the hearth. Their feet, bare or wrapped in soft leather shoes, made almost no sound on the packed earth floor. The floor was cold but not frozen. The thermal mass of the earth, warmed by the fire during the previous day, had retained enough heat to keep the surface above freezing. The cold was noticeable but not painful. The darkness required careful movement. The person knew the hall's geography by a memory. Where the post stood, where tools were stored, where the hearth began, they navigated by touch and memory, hands occasionally reaching out to confirm position, feet feeling for the edge of the set before stepping down to the floor. Falls in the darkness were possible but rare, prevented by intimate knowledge of the space. At the hearth the work began. The layer of ash that covered the embers had to be removed. A small shovel or flat wooden paddle was used, carefully scraping the ash aside. The motion was gentle. Too much force could scatter the embers, disrupting the bed of coals beneath. The ash was pushed to the side of the hearth, piled temporarily until it could be disposed of later. As the ash was cleared, the embers became visible. They glowed faintly, orange and red, pulsing slightly as air reached them. The sight was reassuring. The fire had survived the night. The coals were still hot, still capable of being brought back to full life. The person performing this task felt relief even if they did not consciously acknowledge it. The fire's survival meant another day of warmth, another day of survival for the household. The sight of living embers was never taken for granted. Every morning brought the small risk that the fire had died, that something had gone wrong with the banking. Seeing the glow meant that risk had not materialized, that the morning's work could proceed normally. The relief was real, if quickly passed over in the rush to complete the task. The next step was to encourage the embers. A breath of air, blown gently across the coals, caused them to brighten. The orange glow intensified, spreading across the surface of the embers. Small flames appeared, blue at first, then yellow, dancing briefly before subsiding. Another breath, longer and steadier, brought more flames. The coals responded, their heat increasing. The breath had to be controlled. Too weak, and the embers would not respond. Too strong, and ash would scatter, some landing on the embers and dampening them. The correct breath was steady, sustained. directed at the hottest part of the ember bed. The person learned this through experience, developing the skill over years of morning fire tending. Small pieces of peat were added, placed carefully on the glowing embers. The peat did not catch fire immediately. It heated slowly, the surface darkening, beginning to smoke. More air was needed. The person knelt, leaning close to the hearth, blowing steadily on the peat. The smoke increased, then a small flame appeared, licking at the edge of the peat block. The flame grew, spreading across the surface. More peat was added, piece by piece, building the fire gradually. The flames remained small, not the roaring blaze of a wood fire, but the steady, controlled burn of peat. The heat output increased. The stones of the hearth, which had cooled slightly overnight, began to warm again. The air directly above the fire grew noticeably warmer. The warmth from the renewed fire was immediate and welcome. The person tending it felt the heat on their face and hands, the first real warmth since leaving the bedding. They positioned themselves to capture as much of this warmth as possible while continuing to feed the fire. The cold of the early morning began to retreat. The process took time, 10 or 15 minutes from uncovering the embers to having a functional fire. During this time, the rest of the household remained asleep or drifted in the space between sleep and waking. The sounds of the fire being rebuilt were familiar, expected. They signalled the beginning of the day, the return to routine. As the fire grew, light returned to the hall. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls and ceiling. The interior became visible again. The timber posts, the raised platforms, the shapes of people under blankets, the darkness retreated, not banished but pushed back to the corners and edges of the room. The return of light transformed the space. What had been formless darkness became defined architecture. The familiar became visible again. The household, which had existed as sound and sensation during the night, became visible reality. The transformation happened gradually, matching the fire's growth, until the hall was once again a space that could be seen and navigated. The person tending the fire remained by the hearth, feeding it, watching it, ensuring it was stable before moving on to other tasks. The fire was the foundation of the day. Everything else depended on it: cooking, warmth, light. Once the fire was secure, the household could fully wake and begin the day's work. Gradually others began to stir. The light and warmth from the renewed fire reached the sleeping platforms. People pulled back the blankets, sat up, rubbed their faces. Children woke more slowly, needing encouragement. The transition from sleep to waking was leisurely, without urgency. There was no schedule to meet, no external pressure. The day would unfold at its own pace. The waking process followed individual rhythms. Some people woke quickly, alert within minutes. Others woke slowly, requiring time to fully emerge from sleep. The household accommodated these differences. No one rushed those who woke slowly. No one complained about those who rose quickly. The variation was accepted as normal, part of the diversity of human temperament. The breaking. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, incrementally, over weeks and months. The first signs were subtle, the days lengthening by a few minutes each week, the sun rising slightly higher above the southern horizon. These changes were almost imperceptible day to day, but over time they accumulated into something noticeable. The lengthening of days was carefully monitored. The household knew when the winter solstice passed, when the days began growing longer again. This knowledge was important psychologically. It meant the worst was over, that the progression toward warmth and light had begun. Even though months of cold remained, the direction was positive. In late winter, the sun's arc across the sky was still shallow, but it no longer skimmed the horizon for just a few hours. By early spring, the daylight period had extended to 6 hours, then 8. The quality of the light changed. What had been grey twilight became genuine illumination. Shadows appeared, cast by objects in the weak sunlight. The landscape gained definition, contrast, depth. The shadows were startling after months of shadowless dimness. They created three-dimensionality, making the landscape comprehensible in new ways. Distances could be judged more accurately. Terrain features became distinct. The world, which had been flat and formless, acquired shape and structure. The snow on the roof began to melt. Not all at once, but in cycles. During the brief hours of sunlight, the surface layer would soften, becoming wet. At night, it would refreeze. This cycle repeated, gradually reducing the depth of the snow. Meltwater trickled down the turf roof, absorbed by the layers of sod, draining away at the edges. The roof remained waterproof. The birch bark beneath the turf prevented water from penetrating into the interior. The sound of meltwater was new. It dripped from the eaves, creating a rhythmic pattering. The sound marked change, the breaking of winter's grip. People listened to it with satisfaction, knowing it meant progress towards spring. The dripping became a constant presence during daylight hours, stopping at night when temperatures dropped but resuming each morning. As the snow thinned, the grass on the roof became visible again. It was brown and matted from being buried under snow for months, but it was alive. The roots had survived. As temperatures rose and daylight increased, the grass began to grow. New green shoots appeared, pushing through the dead thatch. The roof transitioned from white to brown to green over the course of weeks. The greening of the roof was visible evidence of spring. The household watched the progression, noting when the first green appeared, when it spread to cover significant areas, when the entire roof was green again. The colour was vivid after months of monochrome white and grey. The green was hopeful, promising, beautiful. The sound of dripping water became constant during the day. From the eaves of the house, from rock faces, from hillsides, everywhere the melt was underway. The sound was new after months of silence. It marked change, movement, the breaking of winter's grip. At night, the dripping would cease as temperatures dropped below freezing again, but each day it would resume earlier and stop later. The progression was measurable. In early spring, dripping might start at noon and stop by mid-afternoon. Weeks later, it would start in late morning and continue until evening. Eventually, it would continue all day, marking the point where temperatures remained above freezing even at night. This milestone was significant, signalling that spring had truly arrived. The temperature inside the hall changed. The baseline rose slightly, a degree or two, as the earth around and beneath the house absorbed more heat from the lengthening days. The fire was needed less during the day. It was still lit, still maintained, but it did not need to burn as hot or as long. The door to the hall was left open more often, allowing fresh air to circulate, clearing out the accumulated smoke and stale air of winter. The influx of fresh air was dramatic. The first time the door was left open for an extended period, the difference was palpable. The smoke layer that had hung perpetually near the ceiling began to clear. Sunlight, actual direct sunlight, entered through the doorway, illuminating the interior in a way that had not happened for months. Dust particles became visible, floating in the shafts of light. The hall, which had seemed dimensionless in the dim firelight, suddenly had depth and detail. The visual transformation was striking. Colours became visible. The brown of the turf walls, the yellow of the straw bedding, the varied greys and browns of stored tools and food. During winter, everything had been dim and monochromatic. The return of light revealed the actual appearance of familiar objects, sometimes surprising in their vividness. Outside, the landscape transformed. Snow melted from the lower elevations first, revealing brown grass and exposed soil. The grass was dead from winter, but beneath it, roots were alive and ready to sprout. Patches of bare ground appeared, growing larger each day. The snow retreated uphill and into shaded areas, persisting longest where the sun's angle could not reach. The pattern of melting was predictable. South-facing slopes melted first, receiving the most direct sunlight. North-facing slopes retained snow longest. Valley bottoms, where cold air settled at night, melted slowly. Ridges and exposed areas melted quickly. The household understood these patterns, using them to predict when specific areas would be accessible. Streams that had been frozen solid began to flow again, their surfaces breaking up into chunks of ice that moved downstream. The sound of running water returned, a sound that had been absent for months. The streams were loud, swollen with meltwater, carrying more volume than they would later in the year. The noise was constant, a rushing that could be heard from inside the turf house if the door was open. The sound of flowing water was profoundly meaningful. It meant the land was coming back to life. It meant travel would soon be possible. It meant fishing could resume. The sound was associated with abundance, with the productive season, with hope. Listening to it lifted spirits. Birds returned. The first arrivals were the hardy species that had overwintered not far away, moving back to their breeding territories as conditions improved. Later came the true migrants, arriving from distant lands to the south. Their calls were a marker of spring's arrival. The ptarmigan, which had been silent and white during winter, began to molt, their plumage changing to brown and their territorial calls echoing across the hillsides. The bird calls provided a soundscape that had been absent. The winter had been quiet except for wind and occasional ravens. The return of songbirds, waterfowl, and seabirds created acoustic richness. The variety of calls marked time. Certain species arrived in certain weeks, providing a natural calendar. The household's activities shifted. The indoor work of winter, wool processing, tool repair, saga recitation, gave way to outdoor tasks. Livestock that had been kept in byres or close to the house were moved to pasture. The animals had lost weight over the winter, their coats shaggy and matted. They needed fresh grass, exercise, and sunlight. Shepherds accompanied them, guiding them to areas where the snow had melted and new growth was beginning. The livestock's emergence was celebratory. They had survived another winter. Their survival meant the household had been successful in providing for them. The animals were checked carefully. Were they healthy? Had any been injured? Did any need special attention? The assessment determined the household's wealth and prospects for the coming year. Fields that had lain dormant were prepared for planting. The work was heavy, requiring the effort of everyone capable. Rocks that had been heaved up by frost needed to be cleared. The soil, wet from snowmelt, was turned with wooden ploughs pulled by horses or oxen. The smell of turned earth was strong, rich, completely different from the smoky interior smell that had dominated for months. The smell of soil was invigorating. It signalled growth, potential, the beginning of the productive season. People breathed it deeply, savouring the contrast with the stale air of winter. The smell was associated with life, with the earth's fertility, with the possibility of harvest. Repairs that had been deferred during winter were undertaken. Turf walls that had developed gaps were patched. Roof sections that had settled or eroded were rebuilt. Fences that had been damaged by snow and wind were mended. The farmstead, which had been in a state of suspended maintenance during winter, now received attention. Every structure was inspected, assessed, and fixed. The repair work was systematic. The household moved through the farmstead, examining each building, each fence, each storage area. Lists were made mentally of what needed attention. Work was prioritised. Critical repairs first, then important ones, then nice-to-have improvements. The work would continue through spring and summer, preparing everything for the next winter. The pace of life accelerated. The stasis of winter ended. People moved more quickly, spoke more loudly, and engaged in activities that had been impossible or impractical during the dark months. The sense of enclosure, which had been comforting during the cold, now felt restrictive. The desire to be outside, to move, to work, grew stronger each day. The psychological shift was as significant as the physical one. The oppressive weight of winter, the darkness, the cold, the confinement lifted. Moods improved, energy increased. Conflicts that had simmered during winter's close quarters often resolved naturally as people dispersed to outdoor tasks. The space and activity of spring relieved tensions that confinement had created. The transition was not immediate. Spring in Iceland was tentative. Cold snaps could return, bringing snow and freezing temperatures even in late spring. The household remained cautious, keeping reserves of food and fuel, not assuming that winter was truly over until well into the warmer season. Animals were brought back to shelter during storms. The fire in the hall was maintained, ready to provide warmth if needed. But the direction was clear. The long darkness was ending. The world outside the turf house was becoming habitable again. The boundary between Innengards and Utengards was shifting. The chaotic exterior was becoming ordered, accessible, less hostile. The turf house itself changed during this transition. The interior, which had been sealed and smoky throughout the winter, was aired out. Bedding was taken outside, beaten, and left in the sun. The sheepskins and vadmal blankets, which had absorbed months of smoke and sweat, were refreshed. The straw and heather on the set platforms were replaced with fresh material. The hall was swept, the accumulated ash and debris removed. The cleaning was thorough. Winter's accumulation, ash from the fire, Debris from food preparation, dust from fabric work, was removed. The hall was scrubbed where possible, aired constantly, restored to a state of cleanliness that would be maintained through summer. The work was hard but satisfying. It marked the transition, the putting away of winter's habits, the embrace of summer's possibilities. The smoke-darkened walls and ceiling remained as they were. The soot was not cleaned away. It was part of the structure, a protective layer that would continue to preserve the timber through the next winter and the one after that. But the movable elements, the bedding and fabrics, were renewed. The household did not abandon the turf house. It remained their home, their shelter. But the intense focus on maintaining warmth and surviving the cold relaxed. The house became a base of operations rather than a sealed sanctuary. People moved in and out throughout the day, no longer confined by the darkness and cold. The fire continued to burn, but its role changed. It was used primarily for cooking now, not for heating. The long fire of winter, which had burned continuously to provide warmth, was reduced to a smaller cooking fire. The hearth was cleaned, the stones reset, the ash removed. The fire was no longer the centre of existence, but a tool, important but not all-consuming. The roof vent, the luri, was left open continuously. The cover that had been used to seal the house during blizzards was removed entirely and stored. Daylight streamed through the opening, illuminating the interior in a way that had not been possible during the winter months. The shaft of light moved across the hall as the sun travelled across the sky, marking the passage of time visibly. By late spring, the landscape was transformed. The snow was gone except from the highest peaks. Grass grew thick and green across the hills. Wild flowers bloomed in sheltered areas. Yellow buttercups, white mountain avens, purple thyme. The streams that had roared with meltwater in early spring settled into steadier flows. The sun, now high in the sky, provided warmth as well as light. On calm days, the temperature rose above 10 degrees Celsius, even 15 on exceptional days. The warmth was genuine, not just relative to winter's cold, but actually warm. People could work outside without heavy clothing. Sweat became possible again. The body's cooling system reactivated after months of dormancy. The warmth was luxurious, almost overwhelming after the long cold. The cycle of survival had completed. The household had endured another winter. The turf house had performed its function, maintaining a habitable environment through months of cold and darkness. The fire had been kept alive. The food stores had been sufficient. The collective warmth of the household had sustained them. Everyone who went into the winter had emerged into spring. Success, what remained. The Viking turf house was a response to extreme scarcity. There were no trees for timber. Stone was abundant but unsuitable for insulation. What remained was the earth itself, cut into blocks, stacked and shaped into walls. The solution was not primitive. It was engineered, refined over generations to maximize effectiveness with available resources. The engineering was empirical rather than theoretical. The Vikings did not have modern physics, did not understand the heat transfer in scientific terms, but they understood practically, through observation and experience, what worked. They knew that thick walls kept the interior warmer. They knew that building into hillsides provided baseline warmth. They knew that peat burned slowly and steadily. They knew that sleeping together was warmer than sleeping apart. This practical knowledge was refined over centuries, each generation adding small improvements. The principles were straightforward. Thick walls provided insulation and thermal mass. Semi-subterranean siting accessed the Earth's stable temperature. A banked fire provided supplemental heat without requiring large amounts of fuel. Communal sleeping arrangements concentrated body heat. Layered bedding trapped warmth. Each element contributed to creating a system that maintained habitable conditions through harsh winter months. The system required only materials that were locally available. Turf, stone, a limited amount of timber, wool and peat, all could be obtained in Iceland. The construction techniques were within the capability of a skilled household. The knowledge required was passed down through generations, accumulated over centuries of living in this environment. Young people learned by participating, by helping to cut turf, stack blocks, tend the fire, process wool. The skills were not written down. They were embodied, practiced, refined through repetition. The transmission of knowledge was vulnerable. If a generation failed to teach the next, If the chain of knowledge was broken, the skills could be lost. This made the oral tradition essential. Stories, instructions, demonstrations all served to preserve and transmit the knowledge necessary for survival. The turf house was not just a building, but a repository of collective wisdom. The turf house worked with the environment rather than against it. It did not attempt to dominate the landscape. It merged with the hillside, becoming part of the terrain. The house accepted the constraints of wind, and cold, using the Earth's mass to moderate temperature, hiding beneath the surface rather than standing exposed. This approach was humble, acknowledging human limitations, working within rather than against natural forces. This approach contrasts with much modern building, which often attempts to impose human will on the environment, building in exposed locations, using climate control to overcome natural conditions, creating structures that announce human presence. The turf house instead sought invisibility, integration, cooperation with natural systems. This approach was effective precisely because it was modest. The comfort provided was real. The interior of a turf house, with its fire and its communal warmth, contrasted sharply with the exterior cold. The relief of crossing the threshold from outside to inside was profound. The house created safety, warmth, and enclosure, basic human needs met through intelligent use of materials and design. The social structure of the household was reflected in the architecture. The communal sleeping arrangements fostered closeness and cooperation. Privacy was minimal. Status was marked by subtle differences. The closet bed for the head of household, the best position near the fire, but everyone shared the same basic conditions. The house created a physical environment that supported the social structure required for survival. The architecture shaped social relations. Living in close quarters required cooperation, tolerance, and mutual support. Conflicts had to be managed because escape was impossible. The shared experience of winter survival created bonds that extended beyond the season. People who had survived together knew they could depend on each other. This trust was the foundation of social cohesion. The knowledge embodied in the turf house is largely absent from modern construction. Contemporary buildings rely on different principles: lightweight materials, active heating systems, mechanical ventilation. The thick walls and passive heating of the turf house are no longer necessary when fossil fuels can provide abundant heat. The communal sleeping arrangements are no longer needed when individual rooms can be heated separately. Yet the principles remain relevant. The turf house demonstrates how comfort can be achieved with minimal energy input. It shows the value of thermal mass, of intelligent siting, of working with natural temperature variations. Modern passive house design echoes these principles, using advanced materials and precise calculations to achieve what the Viking builders accomplished through observation and experience. The modern rediscovery of passive heating is not coincidental. As energy costs rise and environmental concerns grow, the principles embodied in structures like the turf house become relevant again. The realization that comfort does not require high energy input, that intelligent design can reduce heating demands dramatically, brings modern architecture full circle to principles that were understood 1,000 years ago. The turf house was not romantic. It was smoky, dark, and crowded. But it worked. It kept people alive through winters that would have been lethal without shelter. It created the conditions necessary for a culture to survive and thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The effectiveness of the turf house is proven by its longevity. The same basic design was used for over 1,000 years. If it had been inadequate, it would have been abandoned or fundamentally changed. Instead, it persisted because it solved the problem it was designed to solve. This persistence is the strongest evidence of the design's success. The winter night described here, the evening work, the stories, the banking of the fire, the shared warmth of sleep, repeated itself countless times over the centuries. Thousands of households in Iceland and Greenland lived this way, generation after generation. The specific details varied by household and region, but the fundamental patterns remained consistent. This was how survival happened in the North Atlantic during the Viking Age and for centuries afterward. The repetition created tradition, gave meaning to the patterns. The rituals of fire banking, of storytelling, of preparing for sleep became culturally significant, markers of identity. The turf house was not just technology but culture, not just shelter but home. The attachment people felt to these buildings was emotional as well as practical. The cycle continues in memory. Each winter brought the same challenges. Each spring brought relief. The turf house stood, season after season, its thick walls absorbing heat and cold, its roof growing green then white then green again. Inside, fires were banked and awakened. People slept and woke, the household endured. The architecture, the materials and the rituals of daily life combined to create a system that sustained human life in a place that seemed designed to exclude it. The warmth beneath the snow was engineered, deliberate, and effective. It was the product of necessity, and intelligence applied to the problem of survival. The turf house was not merely shelter. It was a solution, carefully developed and faithfully maintained, that allowed people to live through the long winter nights and emerge into the spring ready to begin again. The lesson of the turf house is not that we should return to medieval living conditions. It is that human ingenuity, applied consistently over generations, can solve seemingly impossible problems. It is that comfort and survival do not always require high technology or abundant resources. It is that understanding and working with natural systems can be more effective than fighting against them. It is that communal cooperation can achieve what individuals alone cannot. The turf house stands in history as evidence of what humans can accomplish when necessity drives innovation, when knowledge is carefully preserved and transmitted, when cooperation replaces individual striving. It stands as a reminder that the solutions to our problems may not always require new inventions, but may sometimes be found in old wisdom, refined over centuries, waiting to be remembered and reapplied.